Upstairs to the Right Music channel. I'm Mike McWilliams. I am here to say thank you first so much for taking the time to show up and to listen to this live stream, this podcast that we're having this evening, and also for your time as well. You know, time is a valuable thing, and spending a little bit of yours here with me is always greatly appreciated. So that is how I always like to start off by saying that. Good place to start. How is everybody doing out there? While we wait for more people to show up here in the live stream, I will talk about some things that have occurred here. I find it very interesting when it comes to guitars that some people will consider some guitars one way, but a guitar that's labeled in the same category, technically, I guess, will be viewed differently. I'll give you what I mean. For example, I went to a store and I was talking about um, the Yamaha Pacifica. I was talking to one of the sales guys, and I was saying, "Yeah, I have one that I did in a trade, and I like it very much." He says, "Oh, the student guitar." He says, uh, and I thought to myself, he kind of put it down, and I said, "That's very interesting because the Les Paul Special was a student, still is a student guitar." And quite frankly speaking, those things are, going at even the Gibson, current Gibson version. Do they still make that one? Maybe that's one of their discontinued ones. But in any case, when they did have those out, those were not cheap. So, it's just an interesting concept to me, this kind of thoughts that people have regarding musical instruments and their real value. It's and putting labels on it that I think are a little bit unfair. Wait here, guys, while I do a little bit of redoing my screen here because I do not have the chat up at all. There we go. Thought I was sitting here talking to a camera by myself again. Scott says hello. Knowledge is causing all my pain. Michael Watson says hello. Hans Muter is here. Good evening to you, sir. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Yeah, Ben is here. Hi, Mike. Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing great. I'm doing fine. Thank you, guys. Mr. Two Hats is here. How are you doing? Everybody's here. Good to have you guys here. Yeah, man, it's weird because a Les Paul Special, which was a student guitar back in the later bit of the 50s, those things are going for $17,000 now. And the Gibson versions, the more modern versions, as I seem to recall, were going for 13 to 1400. And again, that term student guitar is one of those terms like beginner guitar. I just don't really jive with it too well because it paints too broad of a brush, and yeah, it just doesn't really work for me. In any case, yeah, I don't know what's going on here. There, now I finally have my chat and my my video working here as well. So that's a big step up for going forward this evening. All right, guys, I think enough people are here. I can get started. Um, Again, tonight's discussion is going to come about from some thoughts that I had this week. So, regarding musicians, I was watching uh, videos, of different R&B groups, and I was looking at a very old James Brown, very young Prince, of course, and a couple of other artists. And I started thinking to myself, wow, there's something about them in the very beginning of their career that changed over the course of time. It got to they became more polished and more technically correct, but they lost some of the energy and some of the rawness that they had when they were younger, I was noticing. And beginners and amateurs, I was thinking, often appear to be more creative, not more skilled, obviously, but more creative. Um, it's this nexus point between creativity and technical proficiency, I guess is the best way to describe it. And tonight's discussion is not really about, it's not anti-growth. I'm not saying that. Um, it's actually about some things that I think that we as musicians lose as we improve, if that makes sense. And so I'd like to get into that a little bit tonight. Do you guys think that beginners can be more creative than experts, pros? I'd like to hear that in the chat tonight. That's the question I throw out. Um, okay, 20, 20 euros. You look like Obama for 20 euros. For 20 euros, you look like Obama. Survey says. um, why beginners feel free? I had to think about it. I had to go back in time. I had to try to put myself back in my, we're going back a long time ago, a long more years than I care to even admit to. But beginners don't know the rules exist yet, and there's no stylistic guardrails. Um, there's no really anxiety about theory, at first or ever, maybe in some people's cases. But you really are just in this really interesting place where your your mind is trying to communicate a thought to your fingers and through this instrument create a sound that relates to what's in your head. And, that is an interesting process in itself. It's funny. Somebody asked me once, they said, "Oh, you make, they were um, an a person who was observing, not, that wasn't really a musician or anything like that, just a friend. And she was observing with me in my studio. I was playing or something, and she said, "Well," she said, you write songs very easily." She said, and she said, "I understand some people they have difficulty understanding, like a chorus and a bridge and writing those things, and you seem to do it so easily." And I thought to myself, I think in my case, it became an easy thing. It was a theory before it was a theory. In other words, it was something that I understood before I understood what it was called. I didn't know it was called a verse, or I didn't know what a verse, a bridge, and a chorus was. I know that the song starts here, and you change it here, and then you go back to here, and I knew that. And I think that that was probably at a time when that sweet spot for me, where that not only the communication between my brain and my fingers were occurring, but my understanding of what was coming out and how to shape it was forming as well. There was no theory anxiety at all. None. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that as always. You don't, there's no wrong or right in what when you're first playing an instrument. Um, and any mistakes that you make, they're really kind of neutral. You're not really viewed as failures. You know, for example, if you got enough bread and you got a couple of petals, you may stack them incorrectly, so to speak. Um, and of course, somebody down the line will come up to you inevitably and say, "Hey, the order of your petals is wrong. this one should go here and this one should go there. And maybe you made what worked for you with that incorrect, that you weren't thinking, hey, this is this is a pedal, let's put this one here. You weren't thinking, you were just, and maybe it may improve, or maybe, it may take you off the course that you're on with your own sound. Um, Playing outside of time or key. This is another one that beginners often do. Um, and until somebody comes along and tells them otherwise, um, it's not something they're very cognizant of. I tell the story of when I sat down in a jam circle and I got chastised for being out of pocket, not playing in time. And before, I would say, up until that moment, uh, when he said that to me, the guy said that to me, older guy said that to me, I was enjoying it. I was just kind of, oh, let me just play it and just trying things out. I was trying things out, amongst what they were doing. And of course, after that chastisement, I sat down with a metronome, playing 105 beats per minute up to 120 beats per minute. And I sat there and practiced my time, playing in time. And I did that day in and day out and day in and day out, to the point now where the metronome click is deeply embedded in my memory. I can hear it now in time. And but when I was really starting out, that was not something that I was really cognizant of. I wasn't really worried about it until somebody pointed it out to me, you know. And also, I wasn't really worried about genres either, you know. I am not. I still, when I can try to take two different genres and try to marry them together, then I'm happy about that. But when you're starting out, you're just playing anything and everything that suits your fancy, and and maybe it's stuff that you come up with doesn't really particularly fit any genre per se. It's just something that you came up with, and that may always be true. But as a beginner, again, you're not worried about, "Well, okay, is this an R&B tune? Is this a rock tune? Is this an you're not really concerned about that. You're just, you know, being creative. And maybe again, like I said, you may be playing off time and out of key, but you're exploring. And accidental creativity can occur, you know. Your bad technique could actually be something that adds texture to your playing later down the line that other guitar players will copy. And that bad technique will become something that everybody copies. That's, I've seen that. There's plenty of examples of that out there. But again, technique and and things of that nature are not something that the beginner is really worried about, but they're trying to figure out a way to make it work for them. And so, therefore, accidental creativity could happen. You know, if you think about it, creativity really occurs in the space before judgment exists. That's universally, I mean, in metaphysics, that's true. But creativity starts in this place before it's there, and you're not editing it, you're not deleting, you're not self-censoring, you're not saying nah, that won't work. It's so therefore it's in a space before judgment. And I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. I think it's a very important point to tonight's discussion is where does creativity begin? I've been thinking about that, and kind of going along with tonight's discussion. And I thought about it, and it, again, for a lot of reasons, the fact that creativity becomes evident before judgment is very, very clear to see. And so I found that very interesting. Scott says, in my opinion, the best bands grow talent wise and sonically over time, like Nirvana, Bleach versus yeah, in Etero. I mean, I can never pronounce it. Etero. Oh my gosh, I know what it means. I just can't pronounce it. In just a couple albums over a couple of years, the music change grew so much. Yeah, um, it's that early spark, that rawness, and that's kind of what I'm hitting at. So good, Scott. I appreciate you giving me another great example of what I'm kind of hinting at. You know, remember that, guys. If anything you take away from tonight is the fact that creativity exists before judgment. I will come up with an idea for a song, and it will flow through my mind, and I will compose all the parts for it, the lyrics, everything will come. And when I sit down to record it, then judgment comes in. Oh, do I really want to play that, or can I play that? You start getting into there, and I try to get. I've learned to not do that because I wasn't really happy with the results of music that I did after I really got in and started over it. Judging it, I guess, so to speak, and just let the idea. I mean, again, but when I was younger, I really wasn't worried about that so much. I really naturally I wasn't doing it. So that judgment aspect came over time. It was learned. It wasn't something that was there in the beginning. In the very, very beginning, I was trying everything. I was like, let's try this, or let's put this here, or let's play this, or sing over this riff. Just trying things. In utero. Thank you, Maddie. In utero. Yes, means to be in the womb, but I just cannot pronounce that. In utero. Oh. See, even then I screwed it up. Knowledge becomes a filter. As skills grow, you start to hear your flaws faster. And you start predicting outcomes earlier. Where is this going in terms of key wise, or how do a lot of things in that. And as you become more pro, you will self edit a lot earlier than you did when you were younger. That's the truth of it. Again, like I said, I can observe other friends of mine who I know who are producers and observe them, and but more directly myself, and I can say that that's the truth. That self editing came in later, and knowledge introduces silent rules. You start thinking, oh, I don't want. In my case, I'll come up with an idea for a song, and I'll say, oh, that's been done, or I'll have an idea for a lyric, and I'll think to myself, that's not appropriate. Whereas when I was younger, again, if you listen to an album like The Deep End or The Sower, those are some, or even we go back to some of my even earlier recordings, I didn't edit myself. I said exactly what was on my mind, you know, and I didn't worry about what people would think if I said what was really on my mind musically. like I did as I got a couple of albums in. You the innocence of early years of creation is lost quickly. Yes, I think as a beginner, you're just stoked to write anything. As you go on, you grow and edit and refine. Design. Welcome. Hello to you too, sir. Mm, Yeah, Liz works. Hey, Liz. Welcome. Welcome to the chat. Please join in, pull up a seat and join. You know, or that won't work live. I was listening to this producer of this R&B singer again when I was listening to R&B music of this singer named Omarion. Maybe some of you guys know who he is. He's the guy who I told you I was sitting in the hookah cafe in Tokyo a couple of years back, and they were playing his greatest hits album, and it sounded to me like one continuous record. There was no deviation really stylistically in that music, but the producer of this music was on being interviewed, and he said, "Well, I listened to the stuff that they were trying to get him to do, and it sounds great in a studio setting, but when you have to go and do it live, it's difficult to do it night after night, especially if it's not in your key." And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting because that gets into the that won't work live mentality. And in one way or another, we all, a producer, we all think about it because I'll do something and I'll think to myself, how the heck am I going to do this live? Um, you know, like for example, the psychedelic section of Funky Good Time. How would I perform that live? Because you got 3D effects and you got all sorts of things going on there. So that is a silent rule that sort of invades into your mind when you start producing and writing. Mr. Watson says, when I was just starting to write, I didn't overthink it. Now I overthink it all the time. Yeah, that's what tonight is about. Why beginners are more creative than pros. I should have said, I'm going to switch that from experts to pros. Mike, as a producer, how do you draw a line between a band that needs help work to sound good and a band that needs to just stop? You know it in 5 seconds. Jock and I, when we were struggling, we were producing anything that had a pulse when we first got out of college, before we really started working for Reggie. And we run into folks all the time. And what's crazy, like this, what's crazy, there's this group of singers. They were trying to be, like New Edition type thing. And I just, I, I just, they just didn't have it. And there was a girl group, young girls, and these girls were young. By the way, these were kids. These were basically 12, 13-year olds and older. And how do you tell a kid, maybe you need to think about doing something else? That was another tough part. But you draw that line in the first 5 seconds. You know it. You do, and don't waste time, trying to fix something. Jock and I used to try to fix. We One time we completely re-recorded this guy's tracks because they were terrible, and the gratitude that he showed was complete indignation towards us. You messed up my song. Well, some would say we might have produced your song, which is what we do. It depends if the money outweighs the headache. No, there's no amount of money. No, I established that there's no amount of money. At 5 minutes in, I'm like, no, I can't do this because it's going to be like, as I often said, and I still say, it's like pulling teeth. You know, it's like pulling teeth. Experience doesn't kill creativity, premature judgment. Are you do you suffer from premature judgment? Well, take this pill and we'll solve that for you. Um, and you can kill an idea because you knew better, too, or you thought you knew better. Taste often outpace ability. I love the sound of, for example, Miles Davis' kind of blue album, but when I was younger. But the ability to play anything other than so what was beyond me at that point. And so I had more of a way of enjoying playing along with that record by just improvising on top of it. And that was a skill that came in handy later, just like finger picking, came in handy later. So that's kind of the thing, you know. Let me see where we're at here in the chat. Mike, could you be on one of those idol shows as a judge? No. No. No way. And, by the way, some of the people who are sitting there acting as judges in some of those idol shows, you know, I often question, well, how do you sit in a position of judgment? So, no, I wouldn't want to do that. Beginners chase feeling. They follow just a natural instinct, and they accept any unpredictable things that might occur in the studio situation or even live. They embrace it, as opposed to when you get later in life and you want a very controlled live show, a very predictable situation in the studio, and all of this changes the dynamics of the music that you're creating as you go on. That's why in the beginning you sound this way, and by the end you sound this way. Not to say this is a bad thing. However, fans of your earlier work will notice that difference and they may fall off. I stopped listening. I talk about him every live stream, but he's worthy of speaking of Prince. I fell off of Prince after the Batman album, the Batman soundtrack. That was the last Prince album that I went out and bought. And quite frankly, after that, that was the last one that I really listened to. So that was 1989. So everything that he did from 1989 on, I admired some of it, like Diamonds and Pearls as a song. I think it's a wonderful composition. But the younger Prince, even a Purple Rain Prince, would have never written a song like that or even done a production like that. It was so polished. It sounded, you know, I remember I was listening to his Bet You By Golly Wow cover when I was walking through a mall in Bangkok. And I was thinking to myself, man, that sounds so polished. It doesn't sound like the Prince that I grew up on, the erotic city or, or Can We Funk or, Horny Toad, those songs. Um, but this is because he was seeking a consistency and polished results. And as a result of that, it reduced a lot of the variables that he had in his music earlier. It's just a natural thing that occurs. It's one of those things. Now, of course, you know, um, as you polish your results, this automatically means that you are no longer going to accept unpredictability. Unpredictability in the studio sometimes can lead to very interesting things in recordings. And sometimes it can screw up a session, but that's the beauty of it. More often than not, though, there may be something there that occurs that might be a magic. And again, like I said, a recording is trying to do nothing else but to record audibly a moment in time, you know. And that really is your number one goal as a producer. So this optimization, of course, as you progress, will improve your quality. But optimization rarely creates novelty. You And a lot of iconic, song ideas came out of ignorance. Well, it sounds good. Let's do this. Not mastery, not worried about, well, am I in the right key here, or are we exactly in tune here? Because there are some recordings out there that they weren't in tune when they were recording them. They are famous now. they they were not Steely Dan. Trust me. And yet some of the most, iconic rock songs, some of that stuff is not even in key. But you guys know what I mean. And that's not just one of the things that occurs. Again, this, as I was pointing out in the last live stream discussion, the room itself has a certain vibe to it. Or again, like I said, you're trying to catch lightning in a bottle, a moment in time, and try to get that down to tape. And this growth paradox is one of the things that I think is the reason why the music industry seems to evolve around youth, because they are vampires of that young, raw, untamed creativity. And they seem to get off on, you know, destroying it, praising it, building it up, and tearing it down. It just seems that way. At least it comes across that way. My favorite Prince was "When You Were Mine." Yeah, I love that song. And again, it's got a rawness to it. And I've heard a lot of people cover it, but none of them get that rawness. Again, like I was speaking of Hendrix and Third Stone from the Sun, I've heard a lot of people play that, but they don't get that hauntingness to it that Hendrix did. Mike, if he lived on, what do you think Hendrix, speaking of Hendrix, would have been doing in the 70s and 80s? More drugs and British girls. Um, I think that he would have had the opportunity, if he could have kept it together, to have been a producer, to be honest with you. I think he could have gone on and worked with some other bands. And if he was still around at that period of time, I think of course, he was still played, but he would have gone, you know, the route of producing more. And certainly more people would have asked him to come and play on their albums. And you can't even imagine the stuff that he had in him to write. That's the great thing about not playing live. Yeah. Sorry, but Raspberry Beret is the gayest song released by a straight man in history. I was working part time in the Five and Dime. My boss was Mr. McGee. So far, not so gay. He told me several times that he didn't like my kind because I was a bit too leisurely. So far, not so gay. It seemed that I was busy doing something close to nothing, no different from the day before. Not so gay. And that's when I saw her. I saw her. She walked in from the outdoor. Eh, I think it's not so much lyrically. I think it's that outfit that he was wearing. But if you think that infamous cloud outfit was gay, again, I take you back to the MTV Awards where he wore for Get Off when he was wearing the buttless, the pocketless or chaps or whatever the F he was wearing. That that's when he lost me. I have to be honest, that's when he really lost me because when I saw that, I don't know, there's just something inherently in me that said, I do not want to see this man's butt cheeks. And that was it for me and Prince for a long time. A long time. That is, in my opinion, the gayest thing from a straight man in history. And people just ate it up. Um, Again, like I talked about, a beginner will put their pedals in the wrong order. They'll use extreme knob settings. They'll push their cheap gear to its limits. Um, but sometimes, like in the case of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, that really was the reason why that sound came out. I submit to you that that music was born of cheap pedals and cheap guitars, and what a wondrous sound they produced. But they, in the beginning stages, weren't thinking about that. Later on, they had a techie to dial in their tone safely and avoid the extremes. Don't blow out the monitors, and sticking to proven setups. Some of us do. We had our setup, but oh well. Guitar World said that that's wrong, and this is the right way to set it up. So let me start doing it like this, and again, creativity comes before that knowledge. It's that knowledge, that self-editing, that editing that occurs that one has to be careful of. Anthony, is that I see there? Yes. Hey, how you doing? Good to see you, Anthony. Haha, we call that a fashion step too far. I always thought Hendrix could have been like Santana career-wise. Yeah, that's another possibility too. Um, you know, where they could have done a record together. That would have been an inevitable thing, those two guys doing a record together. There's so many endless possibilities in that. Which leads me over, speaking of which, as usual, I thought about that. And I have here now behind me a picture of the 27 Club, including Jimi Hendrix in here. We're going to talk about these guys in relation to tonight's discussion as well. Nothing like playing a PV amp until it starts smoking at a backyard show. Yeah, man. Pushing your equipment. And you didn't really worry about it. You know, oh man, that's my vintage amp. I can't take it out in the fog. Something might happen to it. You're not thinking about that. Or man, that's my $7,000 Gibson Les Paul. I had made it to custom shop and Murphy Lab. I just set it in a case. I don't really touch it. you know, Interesting tones comes from limitations. I've said this 1,000 times. The more you have, the worse off you are in a lot of ways. You know, Limitations. Being limited to what you got, you're going to work the hell out of what you have, and sometimes make it work in ways that it wasn't intended to. The MPC 60, the way that we were using it as producers back in the day in LA was not the way that it was designed to be used. And they certainly weren't thinking about using it as a live, playing it live today, you know. And presets reduce exploring. This sounds good. Let me just dial that. Well, that's a lot different, dialing in a preset than taking a pedal and dialing in what works for your rig, your guitar, or just making it work to sound what you really want, as opposed to taking the shortcut and lazy route. and dialing in a preset. Bad gear used creatively, and creatively. Gosh, sorry guys, tongue's not working tonight. Is where some of the best music has been produced, and you know the student guitar has been responsible for some of rock's best music. Trust me. A lot of these cats here behind me, the ones that were musicians and players when they were younger, before they got their break and had the bread, trust me, they were playing not the best equipment, but they made it work. They made it work. And they had limitations because they didn't have a lot of equipment, so they had to make what they had work. You know, some of the most interesting things happen before you learn how to do it the right way. That's just a truism. This is a fact, you know. And I've had feedback occur in one of my biggest songs that it actually tracked on radio in Korea. Um, I had a situation when I was recording that where I was getting feedback on my vocal microphone that was caught the tape that I didn't notice. And when I played it back in conjunction with the other track in the back, you had this ghost echo, but it was in time. And it actually was kind of cool. It wasn't intended, it was just bad miking that I was doing, or something was occurring there with my bus. But I kept it. I kept it, and to this day, when I listen to that "Taken" song, "Taken with You," um, when I listen to that song, I hear that part and I still smile because I didn't plan that, but it sounds like, ooh, that's a cool production trick. So some of the most interesting things, occur by accident. You know, many legendary artists, like the ones here behind me, these are all members of the 20 Joplin, Kurt Cobain. You've got Morrison, Hendrix, Amy Winehouse, and who's that at the end? Brian Jones. All these people died at the age of 27. The music that they created in their youth, because that's all they had, is considered to be excellent and and until this day considered to be some of the best. But again, I submit to you that the most impactful work that any of those groups really did, like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Hendrix, Joplin, or Morrison, all the people here in the 27 Club, were done when they were younger. That's when they did their most impactful music. Not necessarily their most technical work. That's not what I mean. What I mean is their most impactful music was written when they were younger. Catching up here in the chat. Motor Grader, a band that became Five Fingers Death Punch, started as a art school project band that made a point to always rotate their band members with new students. Yeah, you know, again, so many examples. This music that was created by these people was raw, disruptive, and creative. And this is because they had less self awareness. They weren't worried about how they looked on the cover of Rolling Stone. They didn't have a brand to protect because nobody knew who they were. So they were, well, we feel as though we can't really associate with them because it wouldn't look good for our brand. There was no brand to protect, so you know that was just part of their early career, and they had less expectations as well. Oh well, that last album sold 1 million units. This new single, we expect it to at least do double that. Oh shit. They were protecting a legacy, and they didn't live long enough, frankly, to try to protect a legacy. I'm looking at you, Eagles, for example, and how, in the case of the Eagles, in the course of protecting that legacy, they strayed so far in terms of, or maybe they really showed their true colors. Anyway, from their beginnings, from when they were younger, you know, they weren't trying to be great. They were trying to be heard. And when you're trying to be heard, you're going to try everything till you find something that somebody says, "Huh, I hear you." You know, you're not trying. That's so many. That's the reason the TikTok, generations got it twisted. You know, they're trying to be great, and and then trying to be great. What we're hearing, ain't great. Because they're sticking to a tried and true predictable pattern. There's nothing exceptional. There's nothing, they're not trying to produce a legacy yet. Joe Walsh is selling off his guitars. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, man. I mean, again, you're going to get to that point. Eventually, you realize that younger or older, Mr. Walsh knows that he could buy it'll help him with his retirement. He'll have a very comfortable retirement from the money he'll make from selling those instruments. But at the end of the day, he's going to have one he's going to keep. He's always going to have a guitar, and the rest of that stuff was excess that he didn't need. This is only funny because it's bad. Got a link here. Scott Bogfoot Start Week Episode 1 All Aboard Star Trek parody. I've got to check. I love Star Trek, Scott. I got to check that one out when I get off here. That looks like that might be a hoot. Yeah, you're trying to be heard. You're trying to be heard. You're not trying to, again, like I said, manage a brand. You're not trying to be great. You know. Early work can be messy, though. It can be inconsistent, and it can be very technically limited as well. Don't get me wrong. As opposed to later work can become more refined, more controlled, and more deliberate in its composition. However, again, knowing the trade offs as you move up the food chain, and in production, is something, again, that whether you want it to or not, is going to be something that's going to occur. And that self editing is something that you are going to have to learn to control, I guess. Or, when it's necessary, it's necessary. But when it's a situation where you don't have to, just let it go. Of course, refinement improves quality. There's no doubt to that. But risk creates originality. This ties into why most pop bands that are signed today are group, any kind of group, regardless of which, they're just blah blah. It's because you know they lack originality to them because they are not a risk. They were signed because they were predictable, blah, blah, blah. They're not signing anybody just and seeing what's, let's sign everybody that, we can and let's see what sticks. No, 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 no. You know. So that lack, that fear of risk is one of the problems today. But that's a side topic. You know, refinement makes things better, but risk makes them more interesting. And that's true in a lot of things in our life. So, I just think that the 27 Club is not something to romanticize, by the way. A lot of people do. As I said, there are some people in this picture here behind me that I have deep in doubt questions, especially Morrison here, as you know. We've been through the history of Morrison, and there's questions there. So it's not something to romanticize like they would have you. The lesson isn't about dying young. That sucks. The lesson is creativity peaked before pressure and expectations took over in the case of these people. And they had baggage that eventually led to their demise in some cases. In the case of Jimi Hendrix, maybe people saw the future for him and that he wasn't somebody that they wanted in that. So he had to go. But again, fame, identity, and scrutiny often crushes experimentation. And it wasn't youth that made these people creative, it was the freedom that they felt before the system started to educate them otherwise. Bar bands that learn on stage are the best, yeah. And that was again part of the old system. You learn on stage. The Beatles were a bar band, but the way it was told and the way I'm not just saying it because the history of it, because I've looked into it, they were not a very widely requested band. As a matter of fact, they were kind of looked down upon as being terrible. Make of that what you will, but somehow or another, but regardless, they were still up there doing it. They're still on stage, and I respect that because when you go on stage, it's you're going to really see what you're made out of, whether or not there's a lot of moving parts. But they had freedom. The early Beatles had fast output, they were hungry, and they were rule breaking. And in the case of John Lennon, not afraid to lie to girls in order to get equipment. The later Beatles were studio masters, technically brilliant, conceptually deep, but different creative phases, both valid. But the early Beatles were about breaking rules, which is why they came out with that British set part of that British sound. But the later Beatles really just tried to rewrite write them. You know, the early stage they wanted to break the rules, but they later stages they just tried to rewrite them, and it was a different thing. When you're a beginner, you have an early phase energy without question. I'm sure you guys remember it. If you can go back in time enough, you remember that moment and you might have the ghost of that feeling still somewhere deep inside you, that early phase energy. And sometimes even when you're older, you try to draw upon that. But, you know, that gets tempered with later phase control as you develop, as you move on. So you don't need to unlearn skills, you just need to delay judgment. And you need to learn how to separate creation from refinement. You know, damn it, I'll do it live. And you need to avoid, record. So I'll record guitar parts and I'll bass lines. I'll do this. I'll record a bass line and I'll generally do it in one take with minimal overdubs. And then I'll move on to the next thing. I won't even go back and do anything with it. And it isn't until later that you know because I do that because I want that initial vibe. I'm feeling it, and that's the way I want it to sound because the rhythm section is so important to composition for me. But record ideas quickly. Don't think about it. Get it down to tape and move on to the next thing. Avoid unfamiliar gear setups. You know, don't record. Don't rent a $2,000 an hour studio and then not know how to use any of the equipment. Don't do that. And um, learn how to use and reteach yourself how to use gear wrong again if you can. Maybe that's a tough one, but if you can learn how to unlearn what you learned, yeah, that made sense. If you can learn how to unlearn what you learned, then you might find yourself in a new creative phase of your life that you hadn't experienced, where you have that youthful energy and that no limitations mindset, but you have a refinement and a polish to you as well. Mike, what do you think about British new wave heavy metal bands when that all happened? Um, Again, my favorite one is Ronnie James Dio, as I've told you before. I don't know what it is about. I like Ronnie James Dio as a person, but again, all of this stuff. If what do I think? I think it's all Tavistock induced, and I think it all had devious reasons behind it. Did it produce some great tunes? Sure. At least we got that out of it. Yeah, they were trying to mind rape us, but we got some great music out of it. That's what I think about all of that. Dio was cool, yeah. Oh, is he cool, man? But he had something to say outside and he was one of the early guys to point out that there was a lot of satanic stuff going on in the industry, and he was not co-signing on it. As a matter of fact, that's what if you think about that song "Rainbow in the Dark," I think that's what he's kind of alluding to in the lyrics of that song. So yeah, that's what I think about it. Again, all this stuff, if we could just look at it just from a pure flat musical, basis without getting into any of the weird crap, but they're kind of get to be a little bit inseparable actually. They're all part and parcel of the same package. So there is that. Well, that's my point tonight, guys. That's my thoughts tonight. I hope you enjoyed this discussion why beginners are more creative than experts or pros. There's a trade off that occurs, and I can, deny it. I can see it in my own career. I can listen to the early stuff and then listen to the later stuff. I was listening to some earlier recordings, and I thought to myself, boy, if I did that now, I would change that. But if I did that, then it would, it's like pulling a thread on the sweater. You start undoing that, and the whole thing starts to unravel. So, be cognizant of that. When if you're producing, if you're on, you're producing, you're writing, regardless of what stage you're at, think about what I've talked about tonight. Consider it, ponder upon it, Don't be one of these guys. In that regard, in the negative aspect, but in the be one of these guys in the positive sense that they're youthful naivety towards their just their raw energy was something that really made them what they were. And as long as you got that, you got what you need. I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in this Wednesday night. I have not gotten over that virus that I picked up last Friday. It's gotten better, but in the evenings I start to get those headaches, which is something that I never got before. And it's getting a little bit less, but it was obviously something that was viral for sure. So I'd like to talk a little bit more, but I think it was best if I turn it in. And love to hear you down in the comment section. I want to thank everybody who made a comment down below in the last discussion, as I requested. Thank you guys for doing that. That meant a lot to me. I didn't respond back directly to each comment, just acknowledge that I read it. but uh, but if you could do the same for this one, I'd like to hear your thoughts further down in the comment section. If you haven't joined the community yet, and you can see what a wonderful community we have here. Every time we do a live stream, everybody's here and supporting. If you'd like to join into that, please hit the subscription button and join in the conversation. I thank you so much for taking your time, guys, for listening in this evening. Have a good rest of the week. I will see you for sure this Sunday, God willing. Take care. Bye bye, guys.